I already built the fence. I'm not moving it. That's what he said, like it was already settled, like the ground itself had signed off on it, like I was the one who hadn't gotten the memo. And I remember just standing there for a second, looking past him, past his shoulder, at that line of fresh cedar boards cutting across what used to be my yard, and thinking, there's no way this is real. You built it 8 feet inside my property, I said, trying to keep my voice even, trying not to sound like I was already halfway to losing my temper. And you think that's just going to stay? He didn't even blink, just shrugged a little, like we were talking about a crooked mailbox or something minor, something you laugh off over a beer, not 8 feet of land I'd been mowing, edging, and taking care of for over a decade. The next morning was when it really hit me. You ever have one of those moments where something looks so wrong your brain takes a second to catch up, like your eyes see it first, and then everything else follows behind? I stepped outside with my coffee, same routine I'd had for years, and I just froze halfway down the porch steps. My mower was still sitting in the grass from the afternoon before, right where I'd left it, angled slightly toward the oak tree like it always was when I took a break. But the yard, my yard, 8 full feet of it was gone. Not messy, not torn up, not even rough-looking, just clean, cut, and sealed off behind that brand-new fence like it had always belonged there. The mowing lines I'd been running in straight, careful rows for years were suddenly on the wrong side of a boundary I never agreed to, like someone had reached into my life overnight and shifted it a few feet to the left. I didn't yell. I didn't march over there pounding on doors. That's not really how I handle things, never has been. Instead, I stood there for a minute, took a sip of coffee that had already gone a little cold, and just let the reality settle in, because once it did, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. No guessing, no arguing back and forth across a fence line, no turning this into some neighborhood shouting match. I called a surveyor. His name was Eric Dalton, older guy, calm voice, the kind of person who's been settling disputes longer than most people have owned their homes. He showed up 2 days later in a white truck with faded lettering on the side, stepped out, and gave me a nod like he already understood the situation before I even said a word. "Let's take a look," he said. Simple as that. Like we were about to measure out a garden bed instead of a problem that had already started digging into my nerves. I walked him through everything, pointed out where the old boundary markers used to be, showed him the fence, the fresh posts sunk deep into the ground, concrete still visible around the base like they'd rushed to make it permanent. He didn't say much at first, just listened, took notes, set up his equipment. There's something about watching a professional do their job when you know the answer is coming. It slows time down a little. Every step feels heavier, more important. He ran the measurements carefully, methodically, moving from one point to the next, setting flags in the ground as he went. Bright orange against green grass, impossible to miss. And as each flag went in, a pattern started forming, one I already felt in my gut before he confirmed it out loud. Every single marker lined up the same way, not on the fence, not even close, but a full 8 feet inside it, firmly on my side. My grass, my property, no ambiguity, no gray area, just a clean, undeniable line that had been ignored. Eric straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave me a look that didn't need much explanation. "Yeah," he said, nodding toward the fence. "That's not where that's supposed to be." There was no drama in his voice, no judgment, just fact. And somehow that made it hit even harder, because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding, it wasn't a maybe, it was wrong, plain and simple. I thanked him, paid him, and before he left, I asked him to mark everything clearly, every corner, every line, every inch that mattered. If this was going to turn into something bigger, I wanted it documented from the start. He understood that without me having to explain it, took his time making sure the flags were visible, the measurements recorded, everything lined up in a way no one could dispute later. After he drove off, I stood there again, looking at those flags running parallel to the fence, like a silent accusation stretching across the yard. That's when I pulled out my phone. I took pictures from every angle I could think of, wide shots, close-ups, angles showing the fence and the markers together, anything that captured the full picture of what had happened. I wasn't doing it out of anger. Not yet. This was just preparation, the kind you do when you know you're about to step into something that might not resolve easily. Then I went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and typed out a message. I kept it short, professional, No emotion bleeding through the words, even though I could feel it sitting just under the surface. Hey, I had the property surveyed. It looks like your fence is about 8 feet inside my lot. I've attached the measurements and photos. Let me know when you'd like to fix it. That was it. No accusations, no threats, just the facts laid out clean and simple, giving him a chance to handle it the right way. I hit send, set my phone down, and leaned back in the chair, staring out the window at that line of wood cutting through my yard. Part of me expected a response within the hour, maybe even sooner, something like, hey, didn't realize, let's figure it out. Because that's what normal people do when they find out they've crossed a line, literally and figuratively. But hours passed, then the rest of the day, and my phone stayed quiet. By the third day, silence started to feel louder than any argument could have been. By the fourth, it felt intentional. And by the time a full week went by without a single reply, I realized something that shifted everything in my mind. This wasn't someone who didn't know they'd made a mistake. This was someone who knew exactly what they'd done, saw the evidence, and chose to ignore it anyway. And that's when I decided it was time to knock on his door. By the time I walked up his driveway again, a full week had passed, and something in me had changed, not in a loud, obvious way, but in that quiet, settled kind of way where you stop hoping things will fix themselves and start preparing for the fact that they won't. The afternoon was still, one of those heavy, late summer days where the air just hangs there, and even the neighborhood sounds feel muted, like everything's waiting to see what's about to happen. I knocked once, firm but not aggressive, then stepped back a little, hands in my pockets, already running through how I wanted this to go: calm, direct, no escalation unless he pushed it there. The door opened, but it wasn't him. It was his wife, Laura. She'd always been polite the few times we'd crossed paths before, the kind of neighbor who gives a quick smile, maybe a wave, nothing more. But this time, when she saw me, there was something else in her expression, not exactly fear, but uneasiness, like she already knew why I was standing there. Hey, I said, keeping my voice level. Is Mark around? She hesitated just a second too long, then glanced back over her shoulder before stepping aside. Mark, it's him, she called out, and that little pause before him didn't go unnoticed. I heard footsteps, slow, unhurried, and then he appeared in the hallway. Same relaxed posture as before, same neutral expression, like we were picking up a conversation that had never been interrupted. Hey, he said, leaning slightly against the doorframe, arms loose at his sides. No apology, no acknowledgement, just that one word, like the last week hadn't happened at all. I nodded once. Did you see the message I sent? I asked. Straight to it, no small talk. He scratched the back of his neck, glanced past me for a second, then back. Yeah, he said. Just yeah. No elaboration. And in that moment, I felt something click into place, because that wasn't confusion, that wasn't someone trying to understand a problem, that was someone who had already decided how they were going to handle it. So, I continued, keeping my tone steady. What do you want to do about the fence? There was a brief pause, not long, just enough for him to shift his weight slightly, like he was buying himself a second to frame his answer. Look, man, he said finally, exhaling through his nose. Moving that fence is going to cost a lot. He said it like that settled it, like the price tag alone was enough to erase everything else. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, watching him, letting the silence stretch a little. Because what he'd just said wasn't a solution, it was a deflection. And he knew it. The company already finished the job, he added, gesturing vaguely toward the yard behind him. Posts are set in concrete. Whole thing's done. Then he looked at me again, and that's when he said the line that told me exactly who I was dealing with. You've still got plenty of yard. I actually blinked at that, like my brain needed a second to process it correctly. Are you serious? I asked, my voice quieter now, not louder. You're saying I should just give you 8 feet of my property? He shrugged. Not exaggerated, not mocking, just casual, which somehow made it worse. Fences are off sometimes, he said. Happens. Like we were talking about a tape measure slipping, not an entire structure planted in the wrong place. And just like that, the whole thing shifted. Up until that moment, there had still been a part of me holding on to the idea that this could be resolved reasonably, that maybe he'd misunderstood something, or that once faced with the facts, he'd do the right thing. But that shrug, that sentence, it stripped all of that away. This wasn't a mistake anymore. This was a decision. His decision. I took a slow breath, let it out, and nodded once. All right, I said. Not agreeing, not backing down, just acknowledging what he'd made clear. He gave me a half smile then, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and stepped back slightly. Anyway, we're pretty busy right now, he added, already turning away before I could say anything else. And then the door closed. Just like that. Conversation over, problem dismissed, like he'd just shut out a salesperson instead of a neighbor standing on the other side of a property line he'd crossed. I stood there for a second after the door clicked shut, staring at the wood grain, hearing the faint sound of movement inside as life on his side continued like nothing had happened. And I'll be honest, I was angry. Not the kind of anger that explodes, not yelling or slamming things, but the quiet kind that settles in your chest and starts organizing itself. The kind that doesn't rush, it plans. I walked back down the driveway slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I did. When I got back to my yard, I didn't go inside right away. Instead, I walked along the fence line, following it from one end to the other, running my hand lightly over the top of the boards as I went. It was well built, I'll give him that. Straight lines, solid posts, fresh wood still carrying that faint cedar smell. Whoever he hired knew what they were doing. On the other side, his yard looked like something out of a magazine. Fresh sod laid down in perfect, seamless sheets, a stone border edging everything cleanly, a brand new deck extending out from the back of the house with furniture that probably cost more than my first car. It was the kind of setup people put serious money into, not just for looks, but for the feeling of having everything exactly the way they want it. And right there, cutting through the middle of all that, was that strip. 8 feet wide, running the length of the yard, green, even, familiar. My strip. 11 years of mowing, watering, reseeding, pulling weeds, adjusting sprinkler heads, all of it sitting there like it had been quietly absorbed into his picture-perfect setup. I stopped near the center of it and just looked for a while. Not at the fence this time, not at his house, just at the grass itself. You don't realize how much attention you've given something until someone tries to take it from you. Every line I'd ever cut into that lawn, every season I'd worked to keep it healthy, it was all right there, just on the wrong side of a boundary someone else decided didn't matter. That evening, after the sun started dipping and the heat finally eased off a little, I went back inside and sat down at my desk. I pulled up the county website, navigated through the property records, and zoomed in on the parcel map for our area. It took a minute to load properly, the lines snapping into place as the image sharpened, but when it did, there it was. Clear as anything. My lot, his lot, and that strip sitting exactly where it had always been under my name. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the line with my cursor, matching it in my mind to the flags Eric had placed earlier. Everything lined up perfectly, which meant something important, something he either didn't understand or thought I wouldn't act on. The fence didn't change ownership. It didn't rewrite boundaries. It didn't transfer rights. It was just wood and nails sitting in the wrong place. And according to the local regulations, as long as that land was mine, I still had full rights to it. Not just to stand there and look at it, but to use it, to modify it, to improve it. Even if doing so wasn't convenient for the person who had decided to pretend it belonged to them. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet hum of the house settling around me. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt something shift. The anger was still there, but it wasn't leading anymore. It had stepped aside, made room for something else. Something calmer, sharper. That's when the idea started forming. At first, it was small, just a passing thought, the kind you almost dismiss before it fully takes shape. But then it lingered. And as it did, it started to grow, picking up details, possibilities, angles I hadn't considered before. I sat there, staring at the screen, letting it develop, and the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. Then, somewhere in the middle of that process, I caught myself smiling. Not because I was trying to get back at him in some loud, dramatic way, but because if he truly believed that strip of land was his now, if he was comfortable enough to build over it, landscape around it, incorporate it into his perfect little setup, then he had no idea just how much control I still had over it, and how creative I could get with that control. I closed the laptop slowly, the plan still settling into place in my head. Not rushed, not forced, just clear. He had made his choice. Now I was about to make mine. I didn't act on it right away. That's probably the part most people wouldn't expect. I didn't storm out there the next morning with tools and a plan half formed in my head. I let it sit for a couple days, let the idea breathe a little, make sure it wasn't just anger wearing a clever disguise. Because once you cross a line like that, once you decide to respond instead of react, you better be sure you're doing it for the right reasons, or at least for reasons you're willing to stand behind later. Over those next few days, I paid attention. Not in a creepy way, just observant. Mark and Laura went about their routine like nothing had happened. Evenings out on that new deck, music low, a couple of friends over one night, drinks in hand, laughter drifting across the fence like everything was exactly how they wanted it. And maybe it was. Maybe in his mind, it was already settled, fence built, yard expanded, problem ignored long enough to become permanent. But every time I looked out there, I didn't see his yard. I saw a piece of mind sitting in the middle of it, quiet, waiting. By the third night, the plan had sharpened into something real. Not complicated, not illegal, not even aggressive, just precise. It didn't rely on confrontation, didn't need his cooperation, didn't even require him to acknowledge what he'd done. It just used the truth of the situation in a way he hadn't considered. Saturday morning, I got up early. Earlier than usual. The air was still cool, that soft gray light just before the sun fully commits to the day. I made coffee, same as always, but I didn't sit down with it. I walked straight out back, set the mug on the edge of the porch, and just stood there for a second, looking at that fence. Then I got to work. I started on my side first. Measured everything out carefully, using the same markers Eric had placed as my guide. No guessing. No, close enough. If I was going to do this, it was going to be exact. I drove in new stakes along the true boundary line, stretching a bright string between them, so there was no mistaking where my property began and ended. Then I picked up the phone and made a call I'd already planned out days earlier. By mid-morning, a truck pulled up. Not flashy, not loud, just a clean white work truck with a trailer behind it carrying everything I needed. The guy who stepped out, his name was Tony, took one look at the setup and gave me a slight grin. "So, you want it right on the line?" he asked. "Exactly on the line," I said. He nodded once. No questions, no commentary. Just understanding. Now here's the thing. I didn't build another fence. That would have been too obvious. Too expected. And honestly, too easy. Instead, we started digging. Not randomly, not aggressively, but in a straight, clean trench running the entire length of that 8-foot strip, exactly along the boundary line. Precision mattered here. Depth mattered. Because what we were installing wasn't something you could ignore, or step over, or casually pretend didn't exist. We were putting in a drainage channel, legally permitted, fully within my rights, designed to redirect water flow across my property, which, according to every document that mattered, still included that entire strip sitting on the other side of his fence. By noon, the trench was in place. By early afternoon, we started laying the foundation, gravel, piping, reinforced edging. It wasn't ugly, not by any means, but it wasn't something you'd want cutting through the middle of your backyard either. It was functional, practical, and very, very real. Around that time, I heard the back door next door slide open. I didn't look up right away, just kept working, adjusting one of the edges, brushing dirt aside with my hand. But I could feel it, that shift in the air when someone realizes something isn't going the way they expected. "What are you doing?" Mark's voice carried over the fence, sharper than before, none of that relaxed tone left. I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on my jeans, and turned just enough so he could see me over the top of the boards. "Working on my property," I said, simple as that. There was a pause. Not long, but heavy. "That's my yard," he shot back, louder now. I tilted my head slightly, like I was considering that, even though we both knew I wasn't. "No," I said, calm, steady, "it's not." I could hear him moving now, probably pacing, maybe looking over the fence line trying to piece together what he was seeing without actually stepping into it. "You can't just start digging back here," he said. "You're gonna mess everything up." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close. "I gave you a chance to fix it," I said. "You chose not to." That hit. I could tell it did, because he didn't respond right away. And in that silence, the sound of gravel pouring into the trench filled the space between us, steady, unbothered, final. Over the next few hours, the channel took shape. Clean lines, reinforced edges, a slight slope designed to carry water exactly where it needed to go. By the time we were done, That 8-foot strip didn't look like an extension of his yard anymore. It looked like what it legally was, a separate piece of land, defined, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Tony packed up his tools, gave me a nod, and pulled out just as the sun started dipping low again. I stood there for a while after he left, looking at the finished work. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't revenge in the way people usually think about it. But it was something better. It was control. Later that evening, there was a knock on my door. I opened it, and there he was. Mark. But this time, the posture was different. The confidence gone, or at least dialed way down. "We need to talk," he said. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "About the fence?" I asked. He hesitated, just for a second. "Yeah," he said. "About the fence." And for the first time since this whole thing started, the conversation actually began. Now here's where it gets interesting, because what happened next depends on how you look at it. A week later, the fence was gone. Completely removed, every post, every board. The boundary line restored exactly where it should have been from the beginning. No arguments, no drawn-out legal fight, just fixed. Quietly. And the drainage channel? Still there. Because technically, it had every right to be. We ended up working something out after that. Not friends, not even close, but civil. The kind of understanding that doesn't come from liking each other, but from knowing exactly where the line is and what happens when you cross it. But I'll be honest with you, sometimes I still stand out there in the evening, looking at that strip of land, remembering how easily it almost disappeared, how close I came to just letting it go for the sake of keeping things easy. And I think about that moment, standing on his porch, hearing him say, "You've still got plenty of yard," like that made it okay. So now I'm curious. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have taken your land back like that, quietly, legally, without ever raising your voice? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop a comment and tell me. Because situations like this, they're never just about property lines. They're about respect, boundaries, and how far someone can push before you decide to push back.